did not share with the medical providers that he complained of a cold foot and numbness in that foot.
At discharge?
Yes, at discharge. That would be, if it was the first time he complained of that, and the nurse determined that there truly is a neurovascular impairment, that would be a breach in the standard of care not to inform the medical providers.
Okay, but that's a little different than what I'm asking, because let me try it a slightly different way, ma'am.
Okay.
You've already testified that Caroline Stell performed a neurovascular assessment at discharge, and that she has testified that, in fact, there was no change. He could feel her touching his foot, and his foot was not objectively cold on her neurovascular assessment. Is that correct?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you've already testified that P.A. Shaw independently performed a neurovascular examination of Mr. Tolson at discharge and found that he was neurovascularly intact, correct?
Correct.
And that's documented in the medical record, correct?
Correct.
And that would indicate that his foot was not objectively cold. There was no neurovascular change in terms of the temperature or the sensation of his foot as found by P.A. Shaw, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And am I correct that Mr. Tolson's testimony, as well as Corey Elaine Tolson's testimony, was that Mr. Tolson had complained or had told both the nurses and the medical providers, that being Shaw or Jackson, that he had had this subjective sensation that his foot had felt numb or that it felt cold to him. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe he told everyone, all the medical staff that, yes.
According to his testimony?
According to his deposition, yes.
Okay. And am I correct that according to Mr. Tolson's testimony and his family members' deposition testimony, that this was not a new complaint or sensation that he was feeling at discharge?
That is correct. It was not a new complaint.
Okay. So if this is not a new complaint at discharge, according to Mr. Tolson's own testimony and the family members' own testimony, and if the nurse has assessed his foot, a neurovascular assessment at discharge, and found him to be intact, and if P.A. Shaw has performed her own neurovascular exam and found it to be intact at discharge, actually, I'm just going to stop there. I'm going to strike that, okay?
Okay.
In your opinion, Caroline Stell, as the discharging nurse, did fully comply with the standards of care, even if Mr. Tolson made a complaint to her at discharge that his foot felt numb to him and cold to him. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Am I correct that it is your testimony that Nurse Stell, and that if Mr. Tolson told Nurse Stell or any other nurse in the ED on December 3, 2009, that his foot felt cold to him and that he couldn't feel his foot. Is it your opinion that the nurses complied with the standard of care nonetheless?
Yes, that is my opinion.
Okay. If any of plaintiff's expert witnesses have testified in this case that Nurse Stell or any of the St. Agnes nurses involved in Mr. Tolson's care breached the standard of care if he told them that his foot felt cold to him or that he couldn't feel his foot, is it fair to say that you would disagree with those opinions?
Yes, I disagree with those opinions.
Okay. Then I think that's all the questions that I have. Ms. Halstead, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Halstead,
Yes.
did the council share with you the deposition testimony of Dr. Larson?
Dr. Larson. No, I don't believe so.
Wait, that's
Oh,
not
Dr.
true.
Larson. Yes.
She has
Yes,
that
I do have
deposition,
that.
Mr. Justice.
And did you read Dr. Larson's deposition testimony before I took your initial deposition on February the 6th?
Yes.
Okay. And after you read Dr. Larson's deposition testimony, did you inform Ms. McGuire, at least as of February 6th, those portions of his deposition testimony containing opinions that you disagreed with?
Yes.
Objection. You can answer.
Yes, the portions of his testimony I disagreed with were pertaining to the nursing standard of care.
Right, and you informed Ms. McGuire of those opinions that Dr. Larson had that dealt with the nursing standard of care that you disagreed with as of February 6, 2014, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, who is the last person that, according to Mr. Tolson's testimony, informed that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling immediately before he was wheeled out of the hospital?
According to his testimony, I believe it was Nurse Stell, although he
Correct.
didn't mention names.
I think you're correct. And that was the nurse who, according to Mr. Tolson and his family, said, I will let the doctor know of your complaints, correct?
Objection. You are completely mischaracterizing your witness's testimony, and it's being unfairly presented to Ms. Halstead. If you want to direct her to specific testimony, which is a specific
examination, and you're not going to interrupt. Ma'am,
Mr. Gaston, I'm telling you that if you are going to ask her to respond to specific testimony, then you need to show her the testimony you're referring to, because there is testimony during all different times of this patient's emergency department stay. So I don't think it's a fair question if you want to just generally put together all these different witnesses' testimony and ask this witness whether she agrees or disagrees or to comment on it in any way. I'm more than happy for her to respond to your questions if you give her specific information that she can respond to.
because you didn't do it during your last half hour of questioning. I'll ask you this question, Ms. Halstead. What is your understanding of Nurse Stell's response, according to Mr. Tolson and his family's testimony, when Mr. Tolson told her, my foot's cold to the touch and I don't have any feeling in it?
Objection to the hypothetical.
Are you referring to at discharge?
Right.
Right.
Again, objection to the hypothetical.
According to your hypothetical, my opinion of Nurse Stell at discharge when Mr. Tolson states he complained of a cold and numb foot is that Nurse Stell assessed his foot and did not document that there were any changes according to charting by exception because he had complained of the same subjective symptoms during his entire stay. And she did not inform the doctor of his cold and numb foot complaints because P.A. Shaw had just determined his neurovascular status was normal after she applied the knee immobilizer, as well as Nurse Stell determined that his neurovascular status of his foot was intact at discharge according to her testimony.
Let me go back because I didn't understand your answer.
It was convoluted.
I'm referring to the time when Mr. Tolson is in the examining room and his sister's present. And the person who we believe is Nurse Stell walked into the room. Mr. Tolson told Nurse Stell in the presence of his sister that my foot's cold to the touch and I can't feel my foot. Do you remember that that was Mr. Tolson's testimony?
Yes, I do. Yes.
You can answer, ma'am.
Yeah. Yes, I remember that.
Now, is it your testimony that Nurse Stell did a full and complete reassessment of his foot in the examining room after Mr. Tolson told her his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling in his foot?
Now, objection, because you've changed your question, Rodney, because you are now talking about the time sequence based on Corey Elaine's testimony, not based on the testimony at discharge. So with that understanding, Ms. Halstead, you can answer his question, but I don't want you to be confused by that because he's trying to change the time frame on your question.
I'm not trying to change the time frame, and I'm going to ask the question again so everybody's perfectly clear.
Good,
Ms.
thank you.
Halstead, I'm referring to the time that Mr. Tolson is in the examining room. His sister's there with him. Nurse Stell walks into the room, and he tells Nurse Stell, my foot's cold to the touch, and I have no feeling. That's the time we are talking about. Now,
then I'm going to object because that is not the testimony from Corey Elaine Tolson or Kevin Tolson as you've just presented it then. So you need to direct her to the testimony if you're going to misrepresent it. That is not the testimony at that point in time.
Ma'am, what is your understanding of the time that Mr. Tolson told Nurse Stell his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling? When did that occur, and where in the hospital did that occur?
According to whom and when?
I want to know what your understanding is, Ms. Halstead. When is your understanding of when that occurred?
My understanding is that occurred in after he returned from X-ray in his emergency department room, and his testimony did not indicate which nurse in particular was in the room. And that, yeah. So I can't.
And what, if anything, did that nurse do in the examination room when Mr. Tolson told that nurse his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling? What is your understanding of what that nurse actually did?
According to Mr. Tolson's testimony or according to Corey Elaine Tolson's testimony?
I want to know what Ms. Halstead's understanding is after reading all of the testimony in the case.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to object to the hypothetical. There's not enough facts for her to answer that question, but Ms. Halstead.
There absolutely is. Ms. Halstead, what's your understanding of what that nurse did?
Again, I'm objecting because there's insufficient factual support for that hypothetical.
No, it's exactly what he testified happened. Ms. Halstead, what is your understanding of what that nurse did, if anything?
That nurse told.
Objection.
Okay. Is it okay if I answer?
Yes, ma'am, you can.
Okay. That nurse told the family that she would report that to the doctor, and she left She left the room, and shortly thereafter, a medical practitioner came into the room to examine Mr. Tolson.
What's the identity of the medical practitioner that came into the room after the nurse left?
Objection.
According to the testimony, there was no names. There were no names listed, but it was someone that they thought was a doctor.
Have you been able to determine the identity of this so-called medical practitioner?
No.
Does any of your opinions that you reach in this case, are any of them dependent upon this gentleman being an actual medical practitioner?
Objection to the form, foundation, and hypothetical.
An answer.
What gentleman are you referring to?
The one that we've been talking about, the man that came into the room that you said was a, quote, medical practitioner after the nurse left the room, that gentleman.
Objection, foundation, lack of facts, and an inaccurate restatement of testimony. You can answer.
It's not. You can answer, Ms. Halstead.
I did not say anything about it being a gentleman, and that person has not been identified. It could have been any of the medical staff. But the family's testimony, my understanding from that is that it was someone who they thought was a doctor.
Okay. And could it also have been someone who's not part of the medical staff?
I'm going to object and instruct you that you do not need to answer that question. This is not a case where you are to give opinions or give testimony as to what might have or what could have been.
Yes. Ms. Halstead, is your opinions today based upon the fact this medical practitioner who came into the room after the nurse left was actually a medical personnel at the hospital?
That was my impression, because that person, according to, I believe, Marion, the mother, asked her to step aside so that person could examine his leg.
So, for the opinions that you've given in this case, have you assumed that that person is a doctor, a physician?
Objection. The hypothetical situation that you are drawing on is the testimony of Tori Elaine Tolson and Marion Tolson. Corey Elaine Tolson's testimony is the basis for what you are asking this witness to understand. What does she understand from Corey Elaine's testimony? Corey Elaine herself identified this person as a doctor. So if you want to ask her questions, what her understanding is of Corey Elaine's testimony, she can tell you that. But I am not going to ask this witness to respond to hypothetical situations where you are now saying that her opinion, that you have asked her based on your own witness's testimony, to somehow expound on that and broaden it to her opinions with regard to the whole case. That is completely unfair.
Ma'am, I have a very specific question. Are the opinions in this case that you've given that the nurses did not breach the standard of care, are they based on assuming that the gentleman, this medical provider who walked into Mr. Tolson's room after the nurse left, was a doctor?
Again, I'm objecting to the form and the foundation. It misstates the testimony.
You can answer, ma'am.
No, I do not assume it's a doctor. It could be a physician's assistant or a doctor.
Are you assuming that it was either a physician's assistant or a doctor?
Objection. Same objection.
I'm not assuming. I'm not assuming anything.
Well, is your opinions in this case based upon anything that this medical provider did or didn't do when he or she walked into Mr. Tolson's examining room?
Objection.
And my opinion is based on the knowledge that that person was identified as a doctor by the sister, and that person did, according to the family, examine his leg, and that family identified that person as a medical provider.
Would your opinion change if that person was not a medical provider?
Objection. Your opinion is based on your hypothetical situation of your witness, Corey Elaine, and Marion Tolson's testimony. Objection.
Excuse me.
Go ahead, ma'am.
I hate to interrupt for 1 minute. This is the videographer. We have an echo that's coming in, and it seems to be getting worse. So I'd like to go off the record, and I hate to do it at this time, but it's continuing to grow. So I'd like to try to address that, go off the record, address that, and see if we can improve the sound quality.
Go right ahead. Let us know if you have any success.
All right. We are going off the record. The time now is 12:46 p.m.